we have an even...
Careful.
We have an equally interesting scholar from Canada who's here this evening to speak to us about cataloging ancient routes and travelers in the Mani Peninsula. And it is now with great pleasure that I present you tonight's speaker. Professor Chelsea Gardner is Associate Professor of History at Acadia University in Nova Scotia. She did her BA at McMaster University and her MA and PhD at the University of British Columbia. Chelsea's PhD topic was on the Mani Peninsula, which is also that of her lecture tonight entitled Cataloguing Ancient Routes and Travelers in the Mani Peninsula. The CARTography Project is an archaeological and digital humanities initiative that aims to map the routes of individuals who journeyed through the Mani Peninsula in southern Lakonia from antiquity to the mid-20th century. Using Geographic Information System software, the members of the you say that for me, okay? Topography, I have it here. Team digitally reconstructs travelers' journeys and then ground truth these results to better understand pre-modern travel. In her talk tonight, Chelsea will discuss how experimental hikes can help archaeologists better understand the embodied experience of pedestrian exploration and can aid in obtaining data that is used to assess the accuracy of computer-generated models like least cost paths. The focus of her talk will be the results of their inaugural field season, which involved mapping the route that Patrick and Joan Lee Fermer took from Limeni to Kotronos in July 1951, later memorialized in the travelogue Mani Travels in the Southern Peloponnese. Chelsea Garner, thank you very much for being with us this evening. It's all yours.
Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. Kalispera sas, bonsoir. I'm very happy to have your attention for the next no more than 45 minutes. I was told 45, and then I was told 42, and then I was told 40, and then I was told, just don't talk as much as Monsieur le Directeur speaks, and I think we're good. I think I'll be able to handle that. So I'm very happy to be here tonight to tell you a little bit about the work we've been doing in the Mani Peninsula over the last couple of years, and to tell you some stories of the time that we've spent there. I'm saying we, not in the royal sense, but my collaborator and co-director of the Cartography Project is also here tonight, Dr. Rebecca Seyfried. So when I'm saying we, this is very much a collaborative project, and that's who I'm referring to. So can I pull this up? Is this a dangerous game to pull this closer to me? I got it. But I don't have to lean over. We're good. Okay. So, for those of you who don't know, this is where the Mani Peninsula is located. And so we've got it outlined for you there in red. As you can see from the photograph, from the shaking photograph, we're dealing with a landscape that is incredibly mountainous, rocky, tends to be unforgiving. It's not known for being overly fertile. Essentially, this is a difficult place in which to live and on which to subsist. It comprises the middle finger of the Peloponnese. It's the central peninsular projection, and you can see here that the Taygetos mountain range bisects the peninsula all the way down. I'll give you another view here so you can really see what this terrain is like. So the Mani Peninsula is notoriously difficult territory on which to thrive agriculturally, let's say. It has very thin and rocky soil. It has been described as one of the bleakest parts of Greece. There's no lakes and rivers. It's hot, dry, rocky, windy, and again, mountainous. And yes, I have willingly chose to make this my area of study for the past 10 years, and I love it, and I have no regrets. So you can see here, especially, that the western half of the peninsula does in fact have a little bit more of a flatter area, and so where we do see the more fertile areas is on that western side of the peninsula. And we'll be talking about this when we talk about how travelers access the peninsula and where they are able to move around. So here are a couple maps. There's going to be a lot of maps tonight. A couple maps showing you some access routes into the Mani. So Mani, being the second southernmost point of mainland Europe after Gibraltar, is relatively accessible by the sea, right? It's centrally accessible within the Mediterranean. It's got the Aegean and the Ionian seas on either side, but terrestrially it is quite difficult to access. There are only a certain number of routes over the Taygetos mountain range. So you can see on the map on the left, there are a few access points into the Mani Peninsula. And again, I've illustrated with some anchors for you, harbors that are deep water harbors where people can pull up, and there are actually bays that are accessible and not just steep rocky cliffs. The map on the right shows you the modern roads, and these are important because when you're assessing travelers and how historically travelers accessed the peninsula, we look a lot at the roads that people use today and where access points are that transverse the mountains from east to west. So there are a couple access points where you can cross, but you can see a whole swath of the peninsula is basically inaccessible from east to west, right? That whole middle section, you're not going over those mountains. All of these maps, the takeaway is these are big mountains that you're not going over across in just any place. So how were people getting around before these modern roads were built? Well, before the modern road system was built in the 1970s, people would be getting around via stone cobbled paths known as calderemia. These were not the only ways that people got around. There were also walled footpaths as well as goat paths, a more informal system. But these paths were essentially the arteries that kept people moving throughout the peninsula. These were the means of access for the small and remote villages of Mani. The calderemia, as you can see here, this one's a little bit overgrown, but you can see they were well maintained, they're formalized, and they were accessible paths that people could transport, both themselves, animals, and goods around the peninsula before the formalization of roads. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of where we are and the terrain we're working with. And now I will give you a little bit of background about the Cartography Project. So my colleague and I both worked in Mani on the Diros project, which was associated with Alipotripa Cave, and we were there from 2011 until 2015. We both worked on our dissertations on Mani, and we essentially wanted a reason to be able to continue to work there as we were struggling with the realities that many early career researchers struggle with, namely trying to find a permanent job and being able to continue to come back to the field and work in the places that you love without, secure income or institutional access, if I'm being honest. And we came up with this idea of the Cartography Project because the beauty of the Cartography Project is twofold. First, it relies on data that we had already collected for our dissertations and our extensive, intimate knowledge with the landscape. My dissertation was on archaic through Hellenistic Mani, and Rebecca's was on Byzantine and Ottoman Mani. So we had this really nice diachronic scope for our understanding of this geographic region. So we had all this data that we'd collected, and the nice thing about a mapping project is that you don't need a permit to go walk around and to map the landscape. And so we came up with this idea. We'd already gathered a whole lot of data on historical travelers from Pausanias all the way to Patrick Lee Fermer. and the routes that they took and the sites that they visited. And we thought, there's more we can do with this. We can figure out exactly where some of these people were going. And so that's what we set out to do. So we founded the project in 2017, 2018, and we presented sort of our GIS methodology and figured out how to map certain routes without actually getting into the field. So the very first case study that we did was actually completely behind a computer screen without us ground truthing at all. And this was Colonel William Leake's journey to the Mani Peninsula in 1805. We started with Leake because Leake was on assignment from the British military, and he was a geographer, and he took meticulous notes, and he told us exactly where he went and how long it took him to get from one place to another. So we had this lovely data set. We had all of these waypoints. We knew where he was visiting. We had all of this data that we had collected from our own dissertations as to where the historical paths were. And so this was a wonderful first case study for us to try out and to see if we could use GIS applications to refine our understanding of exactly where Colonel Leake went. So this was our first case study. It's been published. It's published in the Journal of Archaeological Science Reports, which is not open access. So please, this goes for anything that we have published. If you want a copy of anything that I'm talking about today, just send me an email. I'm very, very happy to share anything that we have that is behind paywalls. So our application of these different methodologies, we tested 8 different least cost analysis approaches. We tried slope only, we tried paths only, and then we tried a bunch of modified time-based costs like Tobler's function, the modified Tobler's function, Naismith's rule. And essentially, it was unusual, our application of this methodology was unusual because we used least cost analysis to predict a likely route that adhered, for the most part, to known roads and pathways because we had mapped them and we knew where they were. We were only able to do this because we had previously mapped the region's route network. But this really allowed us to have a very robust data set. So we were really happy with our first case study. And then we thought we really need to get into the field. That's what we came here to do, and we want to see if any of this is true. We didn't ground truth Colonel Leake's route first because some of Colonel Leake's route was on horseback and on mule, and we thought maybe that was a bit much for our first season in the field. So we decided that the first route that we were going to ground truth was that of Patrick Leigh Fermor. We chose him for several reasons, and if I'm being honest, one of them was because of the high profile of Patrick Leigh Fermor, and we knew people would be interested in what we were doing. Patrick Leigh Fermor and Joan Leigh Fermor's house is now in the Benaki Trust, and it's in Mani, and it was, it's a really great story. And as you're going to see by the end of this talk, that one of the things that this project has taught me is the value in storytelling. So we knew this map here is not our map. Disclaimer, this is not our map. This was the only map we could find that had any sort of suggestion as to where Patty and Joan went when they traveled through Mani in 1951. So whoever made this map has blocked off some of the areas that they went to, but we said, we can do better than this. So Patty and Joan took off for Mani in July 1951, and they spent several days there. And we knew that if we were going to create a more accurate map of Patrick and Joan Leigh Fermor's trip through Mani, we would need to walk and drive and boat some of the route ourselves in order to ground truth our computer models that we came up with and our GIS methodologies that we came up with against the real world experience, right? It's one thing to be behind a computer and say this is where they would have gone and to plug in slope and time. It's another thing to, be there and be in the landscape and embrace the full experience of the hot July sun and think about the decisions that you are actually going to make when there are only a couple places that you can go. And of course, the reason that we ended our entire project, cartography project, from, we began with Pausanias and ended with Patrick Leigh Fermor, is because this is the last recorded trip that we have before the formalization of the roads in the 1970s. So this was also like a really nice bookend. We made like kind of half-hearted attempt to recreate Pausanias's route. We can talk about that in the question and answer. It was not very successful for many, many reasons. But our Paddy journey certainly was. So what did we do? First, we went to the National Library of Scotland. That's where the Lee Fermor archives are. We consulted all of his notebooks and his journals, as well as Joan's journal, alliteration there, and all of her photographs, which was invaluable. All of this consultation of the archival material was invaluable in our replication of their journey. We obviously had, of course, read the book Mani several times, but this is one of the interesting things about storytelling, right? And the intersection between memory and note-taking during the fact. Paddy wrote Mani it was published in 1958, so there's quite a separation between when that was published and when he was actually there. So we had all of these sort of source materials at our disposal. Our process was, step one, determine the waypoints and landmarks. So this is where we use the notebooks and, of course, Mani itself, the published book, to figure out where did they go, just like we did with Colonel Leake. Where did they go? We plotted on a map. Next, what we did is we looked at the aerial imagery and consulted the path network that had already been digitized in our previous work in the region. It's going to get a little technical for a second, and then we'll move on. So we, again, this is not the royal we, largely Becky, generated 25-meter buffers around the pre-modern paths and the modern roads. She then intersected them to determine where the modern roads were built on top of the pre-existing infrastructure. So these are called combined paths. And then it was possible to determine the extent to which each least cost path and hike route overlaid on the path, on the different path categories. So any of these routes that were generated that deviated from these were considered to be off path. That's what we called them. And these values gave us really the first set of data, of comparable quantitative data that we could use. The degree to which the least cost paths and our hikes followed the transportation infrastructure that would have been in existence in 1951 varied somewhat, the degree to which these all adhered. And again, all of these roads have been paved since the 1970s. So you can see here in the aerial imagery, 1967 to 2011, the difference in what it looks like with a calderimi from an aerial photograph and then a paved section of that same historical path. Then we divided their account into daily hikes and we ground truthed. Ground truth is the nice term for it. We really bushwhacked our way through the peninsula. And you can see an image here from Joan's pocket diary from 1951 showing where they were. Paddy's notes were a little bit more detailed and I have an image of that shortly. So one of the things we were really, really pleasantly surprised by was how valuable Joan's photographs were. We didn't go into the archives thinking that Joan's photographs would be such an important source of information for us. We went in looking at her photographs thinking, wouldn't it be incredible to replicate them? Wouldn't it be amazing to take photographs from the same place that Joan was standing and see how the landscape has changed? Now, those don't have to be mutually exclusive. We still think that it's pretty incredible to take photographs from the same position, 71 years later. I guess it was 68 years later when we were there. But at the time, we didn't realize how valuable they would be. Because, of course, if we're replicating a photograph from where Joan was standing, then we know where they were standing, which is absolutely invaluable if you're trying to replicate somebody's route and figure out where they were. So here's an example. And you can see here, of course, on the left is Joan's original photograph and ours on the right looking up to the village of Nomia. And as you can see, many of our images also captured buildings that still stand today. Some of them are, the difference is more stark than others. But yeah, it was really, really incredible to have these photos confirm that we were in the exact place that they were so many decades ago. Especially when, the notebooks weren't exhaustive and sometimes Paddy was silent about where they had gone. And then we had this sort of, these clues in the landscape, which was wonderful. So we added Joan's photographs to our database and to our sort of records of waypoints. And these are all the locations from which we were able to recreate photos of that Joan had taken. She took a total of 139 photos in the inner Mani, so from Lemeni up in the northwest all the way over to Flomahori was their last stop in the northeast. They circumambulated the peninsula. 139. We were able to recreate 49 of them, which we were very, very proud of ourselves for doing because we didn't think we were going to be able to recreate that many. And maybe that number is a little bit more impressive when I tell you that 59 of those 139 photos were of just of people. So they weren't helpful in terms of the landscape. So we were very, very happy with this. We didn't omit photos with people, and these are some of our favorites that we were able to recreate with folks who live in the Mani today along our travels and along the routes. So these were really, really special. Some of these people we met trying to find buildings. This is largely in and around Vathia. And we met the mayors of these tower towns and current homeowners who have returned to these villages after generations of being away. Some really special ones are the top right and the bottom left here, which include the daughters of the owners of the hotel where we've been staying since 2011. So it was really, it felt like a real community experience. And this was a very special part of the project for us. But the route. Getting back to the route, because that's what we're here for, is where did they go? So this is our final reconstruction of their route. 111 kilometers of travel, 53 on foot, 45 by boat, and 13 by bus. You can see here in these two graphs that the top one is showing the percentage of our hikes and the least cost paths that were within 25 meters of the pre-modern and modern transportation infrastructure. And the bottom chart shows differences in distance traveled, right? So where the least cost paths predicted, we had an average difference of about 20%. Overall, we found that the least cost paths, they selected more direct routes than the most feasible hikes, and where they prioritized shorter distances, let me get here, while they prioritized shorter distances that adhered more closely to pre-modern paths, they also took off-path shortcuts in order to keep distances small, whereas our hikes prioritized following the modern roads at the expense of increased distance and time. So that's where we found a little bit of a difference. And I keep mentioning modern roads because honestly, one of our major issues was that not all pre-modern paths still exist. Many of them have been obliterated by modern construction, and others that haven't been obliterated have gone out of use. Walking is different now. People walk for pleasure, people don't walk for necessity, and many of these paths have become very, very overgrown. If we could find the paths, as I mentioned, not only were they overgrown, but they could be dangerous. Loose rocks, the walls falling in, cacti, maquis, spiders and snakes, even if they're not poisonous snakes, we just didn't want to be interacting with them. That was not part of what we wanted to be doing. But we could not avoid that in many situations. When we couldn't physically pass through some of these paths, if they were so overgrown, or if it was too dangerous on the side of a mountain for us to pass through, we were forced to take roads. This is a major sacrifice in the experience, right? And it's also hot. The heat from the pavement coming up to us was very different than being in the shades of the olive groves. And there's also danger from cars, right? The reality of roads is that cars can move fast on them. Finally, really quickly, because I want to get to the second part of this talk, these are their contributions. So we established this GIS methodology. Again, it's in the article that we've published. We contributed another case study in Patty and Joan's route for modeling and ground truthing routes of historical travelers with a set of known waypoints. And again, we did what we said we were going to do. We created a map that we're very proud of, a map that we think is very accurate. Again, here it is. So I've talked a lot about the technical aspects of this project, and we're very proud of it, and we've got some articles, and you can all read them. But one of the things that we've learned is the importance of being in the landscape and the value in telling a story and relating to people what your experience was like. And again, the value in that as a form of scholarship. So I'm going to do something a little bit different, and I'm going to tell you a story about one of the days that we went on a hike. This was hike leg number 2, I believe, from Pyrgos to Haruda and back again. So this is the area in black up here. You can see it, and highlighted in pink. And it's a little bit different, but I think that this is the best way for me to highlight for you how being in the field as an archaeologist in 2019, this was 2019, our field season, really allowed us to merge our experiences as two younger women back in 2019 with the experiences of Patty and Joan walking around in 1951, and how we literally imprinted ourselves on the landscape as it imprinted back on us. And so, without further ado, I'm going to tell you a little story about one of the days we went on a hike. You're going to take her with you? Are you sure? Matula, the owner of the Hotel Panorama, eyed us with a mixture of hesitation and good-humored disbelief. Her youngest daughter, Panayota, was eager to join us on our journey, and we were more than happy to have the company of the high-spirited 14-year-old. We assured her mother that the next day's walk would be safe, relatively uneventful, and involved no hitchhiking whatsoever, but that it did require a 6:30 a.m. wake-up call. Okay, Matula conceded, laughing. If you can get her out of bed that early, she can go. Never underestimate the defiant determination of a teenager. The three of us set off around 8 a.m. the next morning, driving up from the hotel to Stiruga, the little cafe at the edge of Pirgostiru, where we parked our car for the day. It was in this small village that, on July 8th, 1951, Patty and Joan awoke after arriving by bus from Areopoli the previous evening. Their first impression of Pyrgos was a desolate one. The surrounding rocks appeared even bleaker by day than they had done by moonlight. The rough skyline of the Tagatos had sunk considerably, and the successive humps went leapfrogging southwards in diminishing bounds. The tall tower stood on the edge of the same seaward sloping ledge as the village, and here and there about the stony landscape, similar solitary towers rose like pencils. Where exactly the Leaf farmers had spent the night is unclear. Patty described their lodging as a khani. Like so many of them, it was half tavern, half grocery shop. The windows opened onto a moonlit waste of rock and stone, and a little distance off, a tall, thin tower rose into the boiling night. Based on this description, we guessed that it was on the main road to Areopoli, and knew that it had to be standing in 1951. Matula had told us the day before, after a lengthy phone call placed to her sister-in-law inquiring about the oldest hotel in Pyrgos, per our request, that a 2-story building on the main road used to be a hotel. The building in question certainly looked old enough, but no answer is easy to extract in Mani, and the younger generation doesn't retain the collective knowledge of the past the way that their ancestors did. When we asked the barista at Stiruga which hotel had been here the longest, he replied simply, "I don't know." The first leg of our hike was an easy downhill stroll on paved roads toward the Sklavunakos Tower. Like us, Patty and Joan set off on their day's journey with a local companion. In their case, a young policeman who shared a first name with Panayota's own father, Kyriakos. Panayota's chatty presence added some spring to our step, and when we reached the tower, we were encouraged by her pluck and take-it-in-stride attitude. We realized that in order to get close enough to the tower to recreate Joan's photos, we'd have to clamber over enclosure walls, so she launched herself over, and the two of us flopped over ungracefully after her. Once inside the compound, we relished the satisfaction that the view of the tower, aside from the predictable growth of the trees, hadn't changed in 68 years. Patty wrote, "It stood there like a blank rectangular Italian campanile or a tall English belfry stripped of its gargoyles and finials. It looked doubly tall as there was no pointed doorway, no west window or church's roof tree to break the line of the eye from base to summit. It was built of massive, well-squared stone. In appearance, it was a relic of the Dark Ages, and in Western Europe, it would have been adorned with battered scutcheons. But there was nothing except a clumsily hewn date over the doorway. We were conjecturing the date of its construction, allowing for every imaginable time lag. We wouldn't be far out, we decided, in the 16th century. The date over the door was, amazingly, 1812. We were unable to enter the tower and pitied the poor friendly spaniel who was locked inside, perhaps meant to serve as a guard. He leaned so far out of the second-story window that we worried he'd fall out. Becky had seen him before, and Panayota remarked in Greek that he was already half dead. It was a tough existence for many dogs in Greece. Beneath the window where the dog craned forward to reach us was a sheer drop to an area that had been carved from the rock. A similar catchment area was chiseled into the ground by the church in the corner of the compound. Perhaps this was one of the many rock-cut features that Patty described. Vaults were hewn out of the limestone for the storing of powder kegs, and a barrier of heavy boulders enclosed a wide expanse of solid, creased stones like unhewn marble all round the tower. Cisterns drilled out of the hard matrix of rock were reached by a narrow well shaft with no steadying. From the tower, we returned to Pyrgos, judging this to be the most likely route that Paddy had described as then back and up in his notebook. Yet, as our path from Sklavonakos at first led us downhill and not up, we began to wonder about the connections between movement, memory, and language, and to second guess whether our hunch had been correct. To our relief, the road soon began to incline steeply back up to Pyrgos and the cafe where we had set off that morning. Sadly, our own journey did not involve the intermediate ouzo break that Paddy's did. Matula may have frowned at that, so an iced frappe was sufficiently refreshing. At this point in Mani, Paddy's narrative digresses to a commentary on the Maniot landscape, proceeds to ghosts, dream interpretation, the implication of birthing girls versus boys, and a general excursus on the difficulty of life in this harsh peninsula. His descriptions of the people who endured pre-modern existence in Mani are moving, poignant, disturbing, and evocative. And while much has changed for the Maniots in the intervening 71 years since Paddy's visit, some of the portrayals seem to persist even to this day. The observation that, quote, the woman's life is one of constant toil, end quote, rang uncomfortably true for us, as over the years we've watched our hostess tirelessly run the family hotel, passed down to her husband, a fisherman whose work was outside the home, and raise her 3 children. Relief from this household labor was literally created through her own, in the births of her 2 daughters who have grown into young women whose very gender requires that they work alongside their mother during the summer months. On a happier note, his remark that, quote, life is wretchedly poor and overcast with sadness, end quote, is not reflective of our experience. And while daily existence may not be categorized as carefree or without misfortune, our own many years among the inhabitants of Mani have been filled with laughter and love. While Paddy was certainly fascinated most by the people who lived in this bleak region, his narrative repeatedly returns to the landscape within which the inhabitants must eke out a meager existence. His description of and commentary on the physical setting that surrounds him paints a picture of the landscape so accurate that while we were traipsing through Mani, we ourselves wondered at how this place seemed to have been frozen in time. Paddy wrote, a tight meshed network of walls covers this sloping country till the loose ends trail a little distance up the steep flank of the Tagatos and die away among the boulders. They are there for no purpose of delimitation. It is merely a tidy way of disposing of the stones that otherwise cumber the fields in order that, here and there, an inch or 2 of dusty earth may afford enough purchase for wheat grains to germinate. Winding labyrinths of walled lanes meander among the walls and trees as arbitrarily, it would seem, as the walls themselves. My favorite. The solid rock of the Mani breaks through the sparse stubble fields in bleached shoulders and whales' backs and tall leaning blades of mineral, and all is as white as bone. Sometimes groups of these blades cluster so thick that they give the illusion of whole villages, but when you reach them after clambering a score of walls, there they are in all their bare senselessness, fortuitous dolmens and cromlechs and menhirs. Once in a while, however, the wreck of an almost prehistoric ghost village appears. A sudden gathering of walls, the shells of half-troglodytic houses with broken slab roofs and thresholds, only to be entered on all fours. The rough-hewn blocks pitched headlong by wild olive and cactus with only a rough cross incised on a lintel or a carved, unidentifiable animal to indicate that they date from later than the Stone Age. The pale marble world of rock and gold stubble and thistle and silver gray olive leaves shudders in the midday glare, and one feels prone to test the rocks like spitting on a flat iron before daring to lay a hand on them or to lie down in an olive's fragmentary disk of shade. Of course, the landscape and country that inspired Paddy to craft these words have indeed changed significantly over the last 70 years, and the appearance of timelessness is but an illusion. While the rocks emerge from the ground in the same way since time immemorial, they do so in a very different world. Beyond the geological features that came to life before the leaf-earmer's eyes, the remnants of the human past they admired were already in 1951 established as a part of the archaeological landscape. The feelings of timelessness that connect mid-20th century Mani to one's experience today are largely a result of a mass exodus from the peninsula in the period of the First and the Second World Wars. Entire settlements stood abandoned, And until recently, one could easily wander through the countryside with only the cicadas, tortoises, and spiders as evidence of life. Today, the younger generations are returning to their ancestral homeland, and the abandoned towers are slowly becoming re-inhabited, with the features of modern life that free their residents from the desolation of their predecessors. Massive water tanks are built alongside renovated medieval towers. Air conditioners whir with the cicadas, and sleek automobiles zip through modern roads that render the once unpassable landscape navigable. All are reminders that timelessness, even in the wildest places, is itself ephemeral. If you aren't careful, Paddy's narrative will transport you away from his actual journey as he expounds on observations of mid-century Maniot existence in this painfully beautiful place. But a chronological ambiguity suddenly reveals itself in the book. The travel companions awake from a nap that was never itself introduced, and suddenly they set off towards Harudha, down here, a small town that is actually south, not up, from Pyrgos. Only by poring through the pages of Paddy's 1951 journal were we able to reconstruct their actual route. The next stop after departing from Pyrgos was, in his notebook, I quote, a charming 13th century Byzantine church. No frescoes, but delightfully complex, in spite of the new west door and an absurd square belfry. Prettily carved marble-inscribed beams running between the arches supporting the central dome. In fact, in poring over Joan's photos, we found a miscatalogued image of exactly such a place. His description and her photo immediately betrays the identity of the church of the Taxiarchis in Galezu, which is nestled on the gently sloping hillside southwest and indeed up from Pyrgos. There's but one point where his description has been made inaccurate. Restoration work in the decades since Paddy and Joan's visit has revealed an icon of Christ the Pantocrator in the central dome, set in a frame by those very marble beams that Paddy described. Panayota reminded us that as women, we were not to go past the iconostasis or the templon into the innermost sanctum of the church. So out of respect for our young friend and not willing to risk any divine retribution on those hottest of summer days, we exited the church and explored the adjacent cemetery. Our curiosity was piqued by the scant remains of an even older church. Let's see it there. Aya Marina, whose footprint was barely visible among the graves and mausolea. Remembering that Paddy's policeman guide was from this very town, we read a few of the names, and sure enough, several bore his. Kyriakos Glazakos, literally Kyriakos of Galezu. How moving it was to reflect on the fact that Paddy and Joan's travel companion was so near. We read a passage from Mani aloud in his honor, and then hastened out of the cemetery when we stumbled upon the following words. In summer, ghosts are said to roam the Mani in the hottest hour of the day. Summer ghosts haunt graveyards, ruined churches, and crossroads. We weren't taking any chances. From here, we set off to into the general direction of Harudha, but more clues about the stops on their 1951 route are only found again in Paddy's notebooks. After they left Galezu, the trio went, quote, you can see written here, down to the ruined town, Kuvuklia. Kuvuklia is not found on any modern maps, and town is a tad misleading. The mess of massive, collapsed, unhewn stone buildings is not immediately comprehensible, but this ruined, pre-modern settlement is typical of Mani. And because we had spent years mapping these megalithic structures, we recognized not only the toponym, but also a portion of Paddy's description of this place. Semi-cyclopean stones, wells, huge lintels are carved with a Byzantine cross and two flanking nondescript animals. We headed straight for the inscribed stone, partially hidden and impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look. When pushed to identify the animals, Panayota shrugged and guessed, a dog? The real answer is equally intriguing and wonderful, for while the rightmost animal is certainly a deer in flight, the leftmost animal is a centaur, carrying a bow and arrow in pursuit of his cervid cousin. Now, finally, with no clues left in Paddy's notebooks, we proceeded along a combination of walled field paths, dirt roads, and pavement, some of which, as you can see here, covered a beautiful calderimi, as he calls it, one of those stony lanes that wandered down the slope towards the sea, until we reached the minute village of Harudha. Our destination within Harutha was another church of the Taxiarchies, and as we walked past modern homes in repurposed towers, we remarked how many had megalithic structures in their courtyards. In Greece, the distant past is never really very far away. In the stifling heat of the day, the town showed little signs of life besides clothes hanging out to dry in the sun and the deafening song of cicadas. Harutha is immediately notable for its vegetation, which Patty also described. The little place was surrounded by positive orchards of prickly pear, some of them growing over 20 feet high, vast branching tangles of ping-pong bats, and of malformed fleshy hands bristling with fierce needles, their rims equipped with half a dozen bulbous thumbs. We arrived at the Taxiarchies, a little golden basilica standing among cypresses and topped with a brood of cupolas gathered round a central dome. After a well-earned water break, we took our versions of Joan's photos. The first was taken from the roof of an adjacent building, the steps leading up to which have the date 1950 written in the cement. This was all the proof that we needed that these were the very steps the Lee firmers used to get such a unique vantage point. The view of the church from atop the building is undeniably the very one which Joan saw, but the cypress trees that Patty described and that are just starting to peek out in her 1951 photos are now so tall that they almost completely obscure the church's facade. Her second photo of the Taxiarchies is from atop a different building and shows the northern side of the church as well as the corner of the building upon which we were standing, which has since been plastered over. An electrical wire now stretches across the village, adding a decidedly modern backdrop to our photo recreation. We explored the complex but weren't able to photograph the interior of the church, to which we were granted access by a kindly elderly woman who keeps the key. However, we can indeed verify the state of the walls, which Patty described as, quote, beautifully frescoed, the usual saintly figures evolving across the plaster walls with an elegant and loose-limbed freedom. The exterior of the church is a marvel in itself, as its construction incorporated material from several hundred years of preceding history. Byzantine green glazed ceramic bowls are set above the windows, and marble spolia decorate all sides of the building as well as the bell tower. These comprise inscribed gravestones, architectural elements, and relief sculpture from classical antiquity to the medieval period. When we rounded the rear of the church, the exterior of the eastern apse surprised us with a carved marble slab that Patty must not have seen, because he surely would have noted the second appearance that same day of a centaur in the guise of an archer pursuing a deer. The end of our day was slightly different from the Lee firmers. In the absence of a midday nap under the trees for us, we found ourselves trudging back to Pyrgos Diru in the still blazing afternoon sun. The heat was exacerbated by the fact that we were forced to trek along a paved road, since all traces of the calderemia and the paved walkways once here had been completely obliterated. A welcome break came when we encountered two beautiful horses and a very skinny donkey to whom Panayota promptly gave all her remaining bread. We followed the outline of the Sklavunakos Tower, where we started our day that morning, back into the village and treated ourselves to some ice cream, high fives, and a cooling dip in the Mediterranean. For Patty, Joan, and Kyriakos, the evening was settling in as they left Harutha to walk the short 3-kilometer stretch back to Pyrgos Diru. Dusk and dawn are magical in Mani, as the mountains soften and glow, transforming from the harsh, lifeless grays of the day to purples, pinks, and golds. The sea is irresistible, especially on this western half of the peninsula, as the sun descends in a dazzling iridescence. The maudlin sentiment that often accompanies the end of a day is apparent in Patty's final thoughts as they return home. Outside, the desolate spinney of gesticulating ping-pong bats was hardening into silhouette, and the sun was disappearing in a sad, elaborate pavan over the bare sea. Bare, because the Messenian Peninsula had been drawing away westward to its ultimate cape as we moved down Mani and had now died away. Due west of the window, the sea ran unencumbered for hundreds of miles in a straight line until, just missing the southernmost rocks of Sicily, it broke on the faraway Carthaginian coast. Poetic, evocative, and certainly romantic, the image that Patty paints isn't entirely true. From this part of Mani, the July sun sets over the neighboring Messenian Peninsula. A nevertheless stunning scene that we have watched breathless countless times from the balcony of Panayota's Hotel Panorama. Like so much that was left out of the photographs and journal pages, we will never know why the sunset was described in this way, and whether Patty was misremembering the sunset or embellishing for poetic license. What we do know is that, at the end of the day, we were watching the same sun and had the satisfaction of seeing so many of the same sights as Patty and Joan had on that same day in 1951. Thank you.